Today we're going to talk about transport in angiosperms, and this is going to be part one of two parts looking at transport in angiosperms, and this is section 9.2 for IB. And the first thing that we want to take a look at is the mineral and ion uptake, and this is actually allowed for by the roots of plants. Plants absorb water and minerals through those structures, and something that's unique about them is that they have an increased surface area in relation to volume in order to increase absorption. And so there's a variety of different forms of these structures. In this tree cross-section picture here, we can see the root structures going down into the ground. I was recently able to visit Cambodia, and in Cambodia at the Angkor Wat temples, a lot of trees have these unique kind of root structures that grow over buildings or on walls and kind of are all over the place. And it's actually really cool to look at. They're really, really interesting. The cortex cell walls also help to increase the surface area. And it's basically a specialized layer of the cytoplasm on the interface of the plasma membrane that helps to support the plasma membrane. And so really what these structures are doing is helping to increase the contact between the soil and the roots. If we take a quick look at a little bit more simple diagram here, here we've got a couple different cells of our root structure, some soil particles, here's an actual root hair, and so water and mineral ions are going to be absorbed into this root hair structure and then pass through these different cells and then transported throughout the plants as we're going to talk about. How are these ions absorbed, or actually absorbed? Well, to begin looking at this, we need to talk about mass flow. And mass flow is the movement of water against apoplast pathways, and we'll talk about those more in a little bit. And it delivers new ion solutions to the plasma membranes of the root hairs. The apoplast is basically a free diffusional space. It's an actual space that ions and water can diffuse through, and it's outside of the plasma membrane. In some cells, it's interrupted by something called the Casparian strip, which kind of blocks the movement of the diffusion of some of these molecules, and we'll talk about what this means specifically a little bit later. And so this is all allowed for by the process of diffusion, which we've talked about previously in the year, the movement of ions into the cell from the soil due to a concentration gradient. Part of this process that's really interesting is a mutualistic relationship between plants and fungi. Plants are able to absorb mineral ions from the fungi while providing carbohydrates for the fungi. And so they have this unique, really interesting mutualistic relationship where they're both benefiting from this relationship. Plants are getting minerals, fungi are getting carbohydrates. If we take again a closer look at this apoplastic pathway, here is the movement of water or minerals through the cell wall. The symplastic pathway, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, is the movement through the cytoplasm. And there's some differences here that we'll look at a little bit further, but the apoplastic pathway is generally how stuff is going to diffuse through the different cells. Now, the absorption of ions also occurs occasionally by active transport. And this is due to the fact that the concentration of minerals inside the plant is oftentimes higher than the concentration of minerals in the soil. Plants basically keep a reserve of ions inside of them, and so that builds up a higher concentration inside the plant than outside the plant. But the plant still wants to actually bring in minerals, and so this has to be accomplished by active transport. And this process is used to absorb mineral ions between the soil and the root hairs. And so if we think back and take a quick look back at what is happening in active transport, this process is in which minerals or whatever it may be they're basically being moved from areas of low concentration to high concentration. And in order for that process to occur, as we talked about, energy is needed. And so ATP provides the energy that's necessary to move molecules from an area of low concentration to higher concentration. And so this is allowed for, possible by active transport in the root hairs. And again, these structures, the hairs specifically, are used to increase the surface area for absorption. The minerals that are absorbed are really selected by the plant, and the plant's only going to absorb those that are more useful. Because if it's spending energy to actually absorb the different minerals, it's going to be very selective. So the active transport process pumps in root hairs. The cells pump in ions, and the mitochondria, by producing ATP, provide the energy for this. Plants obviously grow pretty tall, depending on this particular species, depends on how tall that they grow. And so they have to support themselves, and they can accomplish this in a couple of different ways. And the first way would be through thickened cellulose walls. And in this process, it's generally used in herbaceous plants. And so the thickening of the walls in these cells allows for them to be supported and grow a little bit taller. And so in this example, we're looking at some grass type herbaceous plants that the cells have been thickened a little bit. Another process that allows these plants to support themselves is through turgor pressure. And we also talked about this in the active and passive transport a little bit. And in turgor pressure, the plant actually brings in more water, and so more water is in the cell, and it helps those cells to expand a little bit. The cell membrane, the plasma membrane, is actually pushing against the cell wall, and it helps it to be more full, and helps it to stand upright. And so you can see in this picture here a cell undergoing turgor pressure in which the plant is able to stand upright. Here would be a lack of water within that cell, and so you can see within the cell everything's kind of removed from the cell wall and the outer structure here, and so the plant obviously doesn't look quite as good. And so in this process, increased water is exerting pressure on the surrounding cells and helps it to stand up. The last one is something called lignified xylem, and this is occurring in woody plants in which the xylem is lined with lignin. It's kind of a hardened cellulose thickening, and again, it's used in woody plants. And so by using this lignin structure and putting it around the xylem, it helps to kind of create a woody structure that helps to support the plants upright. So those are three different ways that the plant can help to support itself. Now, we want to start looking at the process of transpiration, and this is the loss of water vapor from the leaves and stems of plants. And plants have some structures and some abilities to compensate for this and to move water throughout the structure, and so that's what we're going to look at. Water transport into the roots resolves from water flowing from the soil into the cell. And so here we've got a cross-section of a stem here. We've got epidermis, the root cortex in the middle. The endodermis is this kind of lightly pink orangish outer circle, and then inside of the endodermis we've got the xylem, in which water is going to move through this process of osmosis. Now, the structure of the xylem and how this kind of overall process occurs, and we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail, is the xylem is a channel or a tube, you could think of long hollow cells. And the living content from the initial cell was broken down and turned into a sap, which thickens the walls and helps to produce the xylem. So there are a series of former cells that are hollow, and so water can move easily through them. And in some cases, the walls are going to be strengthened with lignin to help support that plant, as we just talked about. Pores along the outer cellulose of the cell wall allow water to be moved between the xylem and the different adjacent leaf cells as water moves up from the roots through the stem and up to the leaves. And so there's no plasma membrane in the xylem cells, and that allows waters to move in and out very freely. Water is going to be absorbed by these root hairs. It's going to be transferred to the xylem through some process that we're going to look at. Water gets transported up into the leaves, and then it evaporates out through the stomata in the leaf cells. So let's take a look at how this process actually occurs. It only occurs in upward motion. So water gets pulled from the roots and is moved through the stem and out to the leaves, and this process is called transpiration. Environment heat causes evaporation from the mesophyll cells in the leaf and sometimes in the stem, and that water has to be replaced from the xylem being columns within the stem and within the leaves themselves. This basically creates a low pressure area in the leaf cells, and water moves from an area of high pressure in the soil and the roots to an area of low pressure in the leaves. And this is allowed for by capillary action, a process of passive transport. Heat causes that evaporation, and so in capillary action, the interaction between water molecules and the walls of the xylem pulls a stream of water up the actual plant. And so this is going back to cohesion and adhesion. Water is absorbed by those root hairs. It gets transferred to the xylem, and through cohesion and adhesion within the xylem, attraction between the different water molecules, and then adhesion with the cell wall, that water gets moved up the xylem, and then eventually, because of the low pressure in the leaf structures, due to evaporation, water gets transferred to the leaves. And so it actually is somewhat beneficial for the plants to have some evaporation in the plant leaves, because then that allows for this low pressure area and water to be transferred up throughout the plant. This buildup of root pressure occurs because there's an accumulation of ions in the root hair epidermal cells. And so, as we talked about earlier, the roots absorbing by maybe active transport ions, it builds up a low pressure of water, and so water diffuses into those cells by osmosis. The movement of water occurs generally through the apoplastic pathway and eventually into the epidermis. And what's happening in this situation is that the water moves from cell to cell by moving through the cellulose wall spaces until it reaches the epidermis. And at the epidermis, there's basically a block called the Caspian strip. And the water at this point has to move into the vacuolar and symplastic pathways. And the purpose of this Caspian strip, this block, is basically to prevent harmful materials from entering the xylem. And so it kind of forces water only to be able to diffuse through this symplastic pathway. And if we take a look at that here, so the symplastic pathway is actually going to diffuse through the cytoplasm. Water is able to do this because of its structure, whereas other minerals or ions are not going to be able to diffuse through the symplastic pathway. And so the Caspian strip helps to block anything from actually getting into the xylem that might be harmful. And so that's kind of an overall basic process of transpiration. We'll look at this a little bit more detail in class and kind of do some practice with this as well, and do some experiments to see what can actually change the rate of transpiration, which we'll talk about here in a second. Guard cells are very important, as are the stomata, because guard cells are basically regulating transpiration by opening and closing the stomata. And they can do so by using turgor pressure. When the guard cells are filled with water, they bulge, which causes the stomata to open. So this would be the cells swollen and the stomata is open. When they lack water, they become flaccid and the stomata remain closed. And so this can also be controlled by a hormone called abscisic acid, which helps to cause the closing of the stomata. And some plants have actually developed adaptations that help to regulate this depending on the environmental conditions. And so the whole process of this, the rate of this, can be affected by a couple of different things. Humidity being the first one. A high humidity is going to cause a slow rate of diffusion because it causes a non-steep gradient between the interior and exterior of the leaf. So the diffusion is actually going to occur more slowly, which causes a decreased rate of transpiration. The second is wind, and in wind, it's actually moving water away from the stomata. So any water vapor that collects around the stomata is blown away, ensuring a high concentration gradient due to the lack of water by the stomata, and it increases the rate of transpiration. CO2, the stomata are going to open and close based off of the concentration. So a high CO2 concentration results in the stomata being closed and lowering the actual rate of transpiration. Sunlight obviously is going to have a big effect. Guard cells open to allow the intake of CO2 for photosynthesis. If there's a lot of sunlight, it's going to cause water to be evaporating faster because of that increased heat. And then lastly, temperature. Heat increases the rate of evaporation from the spongy mesophils, and thus the rate of transpiration is increased. So those are a couple factors that can cause the change in the rate of transpiration.